Before you listen to this special podcast about Mark Haber and his new book, Lesser Ruins, I just want to preface this by saying that this was recorded as part of one of my class, Intro to Literary Publishing. So sometimes there will be explanations that are more for the students than necessarily for regular listeners of this podcast. But nevertheless, I think it's a pretty interesting conversation, really gets into the book, into Mark's history as a bookseller and how he switched over to being in the publishing world. And overall, just a very fun conversation about a really interesting book that you should go out and buy. So here we go.
Mama, look at my life. This is a long journey. Mama, look at my life. This is a long journey.
Here we go. Welcome to the 3% Podcast, brought to you by Open Letter at the University of Rochester. I am Chad Post, publisher of Open Letter Books, and this week, as a special episode, we're joined by Mark Haber, author of Reinhardt's Garden, St. Sebastian's Abyss, and most recently, as of literally yesterday, Lesser Ruins. And also, Mark is the director of publicity and marketing, you call it both of them, at Coffee House Press. Mark, welcome.
Chad, so good to be here. Thank you. It's so good to see you again and talk to you and talk to your class. And it's a pleasure.
It's always fun to talk to you, and it's always great when you have a new book come out. Like, I'm a big fan, obviously, from the beginning. You're like one of the most interesting voices working today. Yeah, and I didn't read off your full bio of all the accolades that you've received.
Please don't. Yeah.
But there are. I do want to mention the Penn Hemingway Award for Reinhardt's Garden when that first came out, and then your second novel, St. Sebastian's Abyss, was also a best book of 2022 by the New York Public Library, Literary Hub, and Publishers Weekly. So pretty stellar accolades, and it's great to have you here. So
thank you, Chad. It's really it's my pleasure. I'm really happy to be here.
So I thought we'd talk a bit about like Lesser Ruins for sure, but I also wanted to just talk because this is, as you'll hear from the preface of this particular podcast, this is being recorded during a class of mine on publishing. And a lot of students are interested in kind of the authorial process, how you become a writer, how you get published, what that whole process is like. So I thought we'd actually start there. So I know this kind of, but what is your background as a writer? I've always known you as a writer.
Right.
Story collection that I have, Deathbed Confessions, which is not in your bio, weirdly.
I know. I need to get it in there. I think we're going to do a new edition with new stories added in a few years.
Oh, sweet. But
yeah,
I don't know
which will be cool.
Started. Like, if you're an MFA student, if you're like, what's your history is? Tell me your history.
So I really am the old-fashioned kind of like romantic, wanting to be a writer since I was like probably 17 or 18. I lived in LA for 4 years. I waited tables. It took me forever to finish school. I only have a bachelor's degree. And the MFA route wasn't as apparent. I'm kind of aging myself. I'm 52, but it wasn't it wasn't in the cultural conversation when I was in college. So an MFA was not something I even really knew about. I probably was in my 30s when I even heard of the existence of this, even though they've been around a lot longer. So I waited tables and I was just like, I want to be a writer. I want to be a writer. And I wrote and I failed. And failing is a huge part of it. You really have to find your voice, as they say, which is a cliche, but it really is true. Find the way you want to tell stories, what you care about. So I hit my head against the wall many times for many years. I went back to Florida where I grew up. I finished school and I immediately got into teaching. I taught middle school for 2 years. And that is around the time I wrote a collection of stories. And they were published by what you would call a micro press, even maybe a vanity press where someone publishes their own books. I wasn't a publisher, but it was a friend that published some poetry. And I did a collection of stories that I'm still proud of, that I thought kind of encapsulated my kind of sense of humor and absurdity and kind of the way I look at the world. And I think if you read any of my books, the thing that maybe stands out is that I have a way of looking at the world or finding the absurdity in our lives, in our world. And so that was published, and it was a very small press, so not a lot happened, which was fine. And then I moved to Houston and taught high school for a year. And
I did not know that.
Yeah, I taught my first year in Houston. I was shopping at Brazos bookstore and loved it. That's when Jeremy Ellis was the GM, and I taught high school. And I wasn't very happy teaching high school. And I just kind of was at the store a lot and said, hey, if I could maybe, when my students graduate, I was teaching senior English. I'd love to, get a job just as like a placeholder to figure out what I'm going to do. And I started working at the bookstore and I was there for about 11 years. And so my wife actually ended up joining me. She was kind of in the corporate world. And that's really how I became very familiar with that's how I discovered Open Letter. That's how I discovered I was already a huge fan of older presses like New Directions that came out in the 30s or started. But that's really where I became very almost intimate with indie publishing, how it works, what I really love, and how I thought the smaller presses, in my opinion, were doing the more kind of important work, kind of the heavy lifting, as
Mhm.
far as work that's more interesting, work in translation, and and I kept trying to write. I wrote one or two novels that are in a trunk somewhere, and then I don't know, 2016, 17, I had this idea for Reinhardt's Garden. I wrote it in like 6 months and I
Wow.
started to send it out. And I tell this to students when I talk to them, if you are a writer, a creative writer, or a poet, fiction writer, to learn about these presses, because when you do send work out, you learn, you'll save yourself time by knowing kind of the aesthetic and the taste that publishers are looking for. I've
Mhm.
become a fan of Coffee House Press, and I thought that, this would fit with what they're doing. I think it's smaller. It kind of has a foot in Latin America, even though I'm a gringo, an American writer from North America. It fits in this kind of vein of being influenced by translation and trying to kind of aspire to that, almost like meta in a way, in that it's someone trying to imitate translation by writing a book that looks like maybe it was written, that it was published in English from translation.
Yeah.
Someone came to me when they read Reinhardt's Garden and said, I thought you were Hungarian or Croatian. And that's a lot of creative writing, is imitating. You imitate and you steal whatever you can and you throw it in the pot and you stir it. Steal whatever, inspires you, and eventually it'll come out as your own. It's gonna become your own thing.
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely.
and so I sent it to Coffee House, and it took about a year. And then Chris Fishbach, the publisher at the time, messaged me on Twitter at the time, said, "Hey, I'm about halfway through. I really love it. Is the book still available?" And I'm, yes, it is. And the next day he finished and accepted it, and that's kind of how I got on this road.
That's amazing.
Yeah, a
So
lot of it is luck. It really is.
yeah, of
Yeah,
course. And like
yeah.
timing, just like the right
Timing and
timing.
yeah, really is.
There's so much that like you look back on and as a editor that's passed up on things, look back on them like, oh, that book's super popular now, but like at the time it wouldn't have made sense either. Like there's
Yes.
lots of things that just like have to line up and it's, the roll of the dice in some ways. Related to that though, so you don't have an agent? You did not have an agent
I
for
have an agent now, but I
yeah.
didn't before Reinhardt's Garden. So
Okay.
I submitted the book, and it really was. I'm a big proponent in that independent publishers, and these are publishers that are smaller. Maybe they're nonprofit, but they're smaller. They have a small staff. They maybe only publish a few titles a year. My belief is that that's independent bookstores and independent publishers really kind of work hand in hand in a lot of ways. They kind of speak the same language, and so yeah, I didn't have an agent. And around the time the book was nominated for the pen and all of that, I said, well, I should probably start looking for an agent. This was right when COVID was starting. My
Yeah.
first book came out about 4 months before the pandemic,
Yep.
and I reached the three or four agents, and yeah, and I got one. The one I got said, I thought you had an agent. So, but yeah, I mean, you can do a lot of this without an agent. So,
Who is your agent? It's just
Danielle Bukowski at
oh,
Sterling Lord.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, thanks
yeah,
to her. Gotta
yeah,
gotta give her some props out here while we have the chance.
yeah. Danielle
Fantastic.
Bukowski. So yeah, she's been very, very great. And yeah, and from there was just kind of pursuing my passion, which is just like I said, I knew when I was 17 I wanted to write,
Yeah.
and I think it was my ideas and ambition having to my talent and ability had to catch up with what I could see in my brain, basically. So
Yeah, and that's
yeah,
always like one of the
yeah,
things like you mentioned it, and it is worth noting is like to become a writer of any sort, like whatever
yeah.
form it might be, you have to just do it a lot and
You do.
a lot. I've told
Yeah.
this story before, not for this class, but at when I got the Ottaway Award from Words Without Borders was one of the times I remembered that I wrote a blog for them back when they had like blogs from like they had like people all over the world that were like writing about literary things. And I had to write about the London Book Fair. I had written about a bunch of stuff for them, like probably 6 or 7 posts. They're all like pretty boring. And then it was at the London Book Fair that I had this like crazy shit happen where like my room was flooded. The London Book Fair is taking place out in like not where it usually is, but adjacent in this like giant crazy like convention hall next to a makeup and fashion show convention. So it's these nerdy book people and these like, beautifully coiffed like people like very shiny and like makeup. And it was just bizarre. And like I had gotten a fight with the hotel because they claimed that I had flooded my room. It was like this really like strange thing. But it was the first time that I went to write this and that it broke. Like everything broke and everything made sense. And
Yeah.
suddenly since that moment in time, like I don't know that I'm a great writer, but I know that I can do one certain thing and I can do it in that way. But you have to just go, 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 go,
You
go
have to go. Yeah.
until it like happens to some.
Absolutely. And that was Reinhardt's Garden. I wrote it, and when I wrote the book, I'm like, it like this gate opened. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I know what I'm trying to do. I know it. And it was clear as day. Yeah,
Yep. It's really a remarkable feeling. And when you can
it
tap into
is.
that and tap into that flow, it's like the beautiful,
It's
beautiful
magic.
thing.
Yeah,
It's like the best feeling. So,
it is.
so
It really is.
I have a question. So with Reinhardt's Garden too, and you mentioned this, and I always perceive. So I know you primarily through Brazos first. I think that's where we
Sure.
first met.
Yeah.
Brazos Bookstore, for anyone who's listening, is like one of the great independent bookstores in the country, located in Houston, unassuming sort of location, to be honest. Like it's like
Yeah.
a very beautiful store on the inside, but from the outside, you wouldn't be like, oh, that's going to be this amazing store. But
Yeah.
has had at least, I don't know if it's changed recently, but for a good run there of like 10 years, the 10 years that you were there,
Yeah.
Jeremy's there, Sarah B is there.
Yeah.
All these people that are like really smart, well-read, good booksellers are there picking out like really interesting books to display, a lot of international stuff, a lot of small press stuff, which is important because, most of the other stores you go into are generally like Penguin Random House or like the Big Five. And then maybe there's like a few things that sneak through, whereas that was like forward. That was one of the things put forward at Brazos. So it was an amazing, amazing thing. From that moment in time, though, when I first met you, I always assumed that you were incredibly well versed in Spanish literature. That like that was your jam, that you were
Yeah.
probably reading all of these authors in the original Spanish and like that they were like big influences. But I guess you told me before that that's not the case.
No, it's funny because Chris Fishbach, he was the old publisher of Coffee House who accepted my book. He's like, so Mark, do you also translate from Spanish? And
Yeah.
I guess I gave this impression because I'm so I mean, I go through phases like anyone, but I went through, and I'm still in it, but a huge phase of Latin American and Spanish language, peninsular Spanish language literature. I love it. There's something about it. And so Chris Fishbach thought the same thing, that I was fluent in Spanish and maybe I translated. And I'd taken Spanish. I had a tutor for a while, and it's just my brain fights it. I actually need to be immersed to actually learn Spanish. So no, poquito. Yeah.
So, but who were your influences when you started to write? Were there people that you had in mind or that you that
Earlier,
through?
yeah, no, a lot. So earlier, like high school, when I really want to write, I mean, like a lot of people, it's a probably cliche, but definitely Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, you can be funny and you're allowed to do things that you don't think you're allowed to do. I mean, the more you write, you realize, like, to me, literature is freedom. You can just you learn the rules and then you kind of ignore them. You do whatever you want, and there's this freedom in it. I don't think I've seen it done more or better in the last probably 20 years than Fresán. I mean,
Yeah.
his books are like fireworks in paper, but um he was an influence. But since then, I mean, especially with Latin American and the books I'm doing, I mean, honestly, my ideal, and I don't love all his books, but I love Caesar Ira. I love
Mm.
these tiny little worlds and tiny, like 90-page books. And if I could do something like that with a third of the output, I would never want to write. He's written like 100 books. He's an
Or more
Argentinian
now.
writer. Yeah, yeah. I mean, all the time. But I kind of like that, where every book, I like this idea that is very anti-American in the way, not like not America, but in the idea that like the great American novel. And he's kind of anti that. He doesn't take the work seriously and he lets it go where he's not precious about it.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of precious about my work. But I think he does something. He writes at a cafe and he's like, okay, I'm going to go to the next book, which is why he's got I think some clunkers, but some really good
Yeah.
ones. And so Ira, obviously, I think Bolaño, Thomas Bernhard, which I'm now trying to really shake because
Well,
they're like
yeah, this is a big topic I want to bring up with you.
huge. Yeah, which we can talk about because I think people that love Bernhard might glance or read some of my books and go, he's derivative. And at the same time, my stuff is really also like Garcia Marquez, where it's exploratory and strange and not really magical, but um there's a lot of hijinks and slapstick in my. There's a lot of physical comedy, even in Lesser Ruins. There's a coffee machine burst, and
Yes.
so I think I do a lot of things that Bernhard would in a million years never do. So huge influence. I wear him proudly, but I hope I'm not derivative of Bernhard. He's just a big influence.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
let's talk about the Bernhard thing actually, because I was having a
yeah,
conversation about this just the other night. It's weird because we're overlapping in so many things. I talked about the
yeah,
Bernhard thing this morning. I was talking to someone on Instagram randomly, and they brought up Ira as like because I was talking about all the authors that like I love, but like I just haven't kept up with, and I don't understand why. Because
yeah,
like I know they're going to their books will be maybe not their best, but they'll be satisfying, and I like them. But then I'm
yeah.
like, well, I need to read this other thing. I'm not going to get to playing. And Ira is one of those where I was like, I know I don't like all these books, but like
Right.
they'll be fine and I'll enjoy them. And I
Yeah.
just, fell off. That like a good example is that Augustine Mallow, what is his middle name, whatever it is,
Oh yeah, Fernandez. Yes.
Fernandez. I
Yes.
don't like him. Like I think he's overrated. I
Right.
just don't. I'm not a huge fan of his books, but I
Right.
will read every one of them because they're
Yeah.
like pretty good. Like they're
Right.
pretty good.
I,
And that's such a good feeling to have of
yeah.
like those authors, those kind of friends.
Yeah, they're just solid. Exactly.
Yeah.
I love the middle book, the things we saw or whatever,
Yes.
things we've seen. I didn't like the first one. I haven't read the most recent, but the things we've seen, the structure I actually copied for Lesser Ruins. Three big paragraphs. That's it.
Yep.
So I really
Yep.
kind of stole that structure, but I get that. He's not for everyone, and I don't like all his books.
I reviewed that one for the Riveter magazine and I
Yeah.
was pretty positive about it. Like I don't think he's bad. I just think
Right.
there's like a little bit of like the overhype to it. And
Yeah.
like and that first book, whatever it's called, the trilogy one, the
Yeah.
Nocella trilogy, that thing
Yeah.
is super pretentious. Like it
It
just
is.
like drips with this like self-serving pretension. I was
I
like,
like, look what I'm doing.
yeah. And it's
Yeah.
like, dude, Enrique Villamatas did it better. But
Exactly.
like
Exactly.
shots at unnecessarily shooting at Melvill, but like good writer, whatever.
Yeah.
But like the Bernhard thing is interesting too, because this came up. And so for anyone who hasn't read Thomas Bernhard, you probably should. Very famous Austrian writer, very noted for like his style, in which it's a lot of like run-on, comma-spliced sentences that circle and circle and circle. They're very internal monologue. The characters are generally like in some way put upon. Like it could be like I forget which one it is now. I want to say concrete, but it might no lime. Is it lime? Not lime tree.
Limeworks.
Limeworks.
Yeah.
Limeworks where he's in the wheelchair, I believe, right? And he's like stuck going through everything and unable to like physically be involved with the things he's thinking about. They tend
Yeah.
to be like very compulsive and claustrophobic, like really
Yeah.
claustrophobic. And also like the thing that I think sets it apart. So your books have like a lot of the comma splice, go, 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 go. It's
Sure.
got a monologue. It sort of loops and loops. A lot of the same topics come back. So I can see like where Bernhard's been an influence on you in terms of that sort of like
Absolutely.
methodology of like representing the human thought experiment and thought ability. But the thing about Bernhard too is that he's super, super spiteful. And there's
Yeah.
like an anger and like a hate that's like part of it because he was really hated Austrian culture. And it
Yeah.
was very bourgeois and like bad and like too tied up and too moral and like there's no space for things. And so he had to rail against something that like I don't think that you need to rail against. Like there's not a nihilism in your books the way that there can be in a lot of the Bernhard books. And that's
Yeah.
where like I think that it's reductive to say because you use a similar sort of like template for representing thought or
Yeah.
monologue that's then Bernhardian. Like sure, but Bernhard
Right.
also has this other all these elements to it that are so critical to like
Right.
how those work. And I don't see that in your books. I see them being more humanist.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's true. I think he's a lot more kind of um a nihilist and kind of a lack of faith in humanity. And I sometimes will have like in Reinhardt's Garden, like um the Yakov is a little bit like that, the main character. But and I always think of it as a style thing, whereas like so Bernhard is very claustrophobic. It's kind of a monologue or a diatribe, and he's just going, going, going. And I write in first person my novels, but where I'm going this way, and it might be a bit of a rant, I will love to go right or left and digress about things that are often very silly or very funny. And it kind of more exploratory where he'll stay in this lane. So I think that's hopefully a stylistic difference. But
I have to say too, like there was a point in time when I was at Delkey and we thought that there would be a chance to do some of the Bernhard books when
yeah,
kind of like when Chicago had I don't have them on my shelf because everything's downstairs, but they had like these old school like monotone or monochrome like single black and white picture uh covers, and
yeah,
their release was expiring. So like were they going to be reissued? Who was going to do them? We thought we'd do them.
right.
I read like all of them, like
Mhm.
everything that I could read, all like one after another. And my distinct memory is like I'm not going to go back to that because reading so many of those in a row is like a kind of like heavy,
It
unfun
is.
process on some level. Whereas I finished Lesser Ruins, and I was like, I'd go back
Uh,
to like the other books. This is fun.
Thank you.
This is enjoyable. There's more to it. So
Yeah.
with Lesser Ruins, let's stay here for a second. How
Sure.
do you describe it? You give me your elevator pitch.
Okay. I would
And
say
this
it
is
is
let me preface this though. So part of the assignment for one of the assignments for the class that is watching this interview take place is to do like a marketing presentation on one of three books. And four people are assigned Lesser Ruins. So
I'm
they are
sorry.
going to get a little cheat code here on how to
Nice.
talk about Lesser Ruins and how to present it. So,
Yes.
fair for them.
Okay.
So
So,
here you
with the
go.
elevator pitch, you've got to be short and quick and, like really kind of like 30 seconds or less, preferably 15.
Yep.
Um, Not to sound like uppity, I would say it is a digressive meditation on grief.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would say that it's about grief, but it's so many other things. And I think now I'm off the pitch already, but as much as there's grief, I hopefully there's I wanted the writing to be ecstatic. I wanted it to be really kind of the writing that the Marcel does about music. I wanted that to be very joyful and kind of exuberant.
Yeah.
Kind of counterbalance with the grief.
So it is really a book with four characters to it, one of whom's not there. There's our
Yeah,
narrator that is a community college professor,
yeah.
he's retired and or been fired
Fire.
because of various events that revolve around his passion for teaching and his
Exactly.
passion for Montaigne. He's
Yeah,
working on a book about Montaigne, the famous essayist and writer, but not really. All he's really working on is a list of titles for an imaginary book,
right.
which will strike home with a lot of people who are writers.
Yeah,
Got to have that title, got to get that before you can go forward, you know?
exactly. I need, yeah.
And so he's doing a lot of research on Montaigne, but like at this imaginary institute in the Berkshires, which is a brilliant creation and very fun creation that
Thank you.
sort of smacks of like bread loaf at times, which I thought was very funny. And I don't know if that's intentional, but
Not
they're
at all, no. But I have a feeling of what a lot of these residents are like. So I was trying to borrow from what I figure Breadloaf probably is much like.
yep,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
got a good part of it there.
yeah.
Good.
Like a lot of writers slash with like Midsummer.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
are we
yeah.
writers or did we join a cult? Yeah.
There's also a hint of like Art Omai, which I don't know if you've been to Art Omai.
No.
So Art Omai is great for anyone who's a writer or translator. Ledig House is like it's a whole kind of like artistic retreat. So they have different disciplines. For literature, it's called the Ledig House. But they also have sculpture, and then they have a huge sculpture garden. And so one of the people that he meets at this is a sculptor. God, I'm blanking on her name.
Christ.
Kleist. And she is making these sculptures related to World War II and the Holocaust, and ends up that spoiler ends up passing away. Then there's his dead wife, who's dead the whole time, who died recently, according to the timeline of the book, like within a week, it seems,
Yeah.
or 10 days.
About a week. Yeah.
And he's essentially very much trying to avoid that. And that's where like your meditation on grief becomes really, really strong, I think, is that
Yeah.
he's doing
Thank you.
everything he can to avoid that. And part of that is like this obsession with writing this book that he's never writing, and avoiding her closet in specific. And then they have a son, Marcel, who is obsessed with deep house electronic music and pontificates about it at every chance he gets. And those parts fucking love. Those are my sort of music. I love that stuff.
Thank you.
Everything in there, as we texted over and over and over again, has like
Yeah.
it just brought me back home to like my Fortet obsession and
Oh, I love
everything.
it.
I'm so there for it. So there's really like those four characters that sort of are there. But yeah,
Yeah.
most of it is like it's all in his mind, and he's sort of like recounting all of them. And I don't want to give away my sort of interpretation of the whole thing, but
Yeah,
to a point, I think that like that sort of obsession and of like loopingness, and the fact that he's so reliant on this manuscript, this book that's not existent, and is so obsessed with it, is really like the kind of like padding around your mind that keeps you away from other humans. And that
yeah,
like being able to have that connection in real life, in like a real experience, is so deadened from grief and from these other like occurrences in his life that he has to try and find a way back there. And
yeah,
it's so much more natural among us, among 21st century people, to
yeah,
instead just be distracted. So it's a lot about like that distraction of like, why would we face this face to face in real life when we can just like play on our phone, or like
yeah,
write out this book, or like think about do this other thing, or like, whatever, and just avoid. There's so much avoidance that's part of like
yeah.
distraction.
Yeah, and you just made a point that I haven't thought. This is actually my first event for the book. I'm doing my launch like next week. So this is kind of like my virtual launch. So
There we
I haven't
go.
really
Love it.
spoken about it, but you make a good point. And also is that that padding and using kind of the manuscript as like a way to avoid grief and pain and connection with people was also the padding he had when his wife was alive. So he never
Yeah.
really, like, he lost connection with her, I think, because he was so myopic. I'm like, it's me, it's my book, I've got to do this. So even before the book starts, I think there was also padding, which I just thought about right now. But yeah,
Buying the roll top desk, brilliant. You got to
thank
have
you.
that roll top desk for
Gotta
sure.
have the role, you gotta have everything in order. Yeah.
If you
And
don't have that,
also,
how great.
how are you going to do it?
I you also hit a little close to home for me because I'm working on this book about Delkey Archives history, and I
Ah,
worked out like a ton of structure and a ton of like where pieces need to go and how it's going to
right.
function. I have all that like down cold, I think. I mean, it'll evolve as you write, but like
Sure, sure.
there's a roadmap. And I wrote like a ton of it over the summer, but got to a point where I was like, oh, well, I really need to be at Stanford to go through the archives to fill in X, Y, or Z. And I could go forward and like come back to that, but I'm like, I really need that. I just need
Yeah,
that
it's
first.
not going to
Like,
happen.
I'm
Right.
just
That's
gonna
the
keep thinking
linchpin.
about. I just need that.
Yeah, yeah, that's so human. And yeah, you're like, well, I'm frozen and paralyzed until I can do that thing.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Need the right time, I need the right desk.
Yeah,
I
I
can't
need
do
the
it where
right
I am because I
exactly.
don't have my desk.
Yeah, I
Like,
don't have the coffee I love. Yeah, it's not going to happen.
oh my
Uh,
God, the coffee stuff is hilarious.
thank you.
Because I
Yeah.
make my Costco coffee before class. You're like, he's like deep into like an Italian espresso machine that explodes and everything. It's wonderful.
Yeah. And that really is very much me. Like my wife, I'll go into a coffee shop with my wife and get a coffee, and she'll look at me almost like nervous, like, how's the coffee? And I'm like, it's sweet. I'll like roll. I'm an absolute elitist. I admit it. I want good coffee. And there's a lot of me in this book. Um, other thing I wanted to mention really quick is that the book is really a trope. There's some, and I love books that are about writing a book that you can't finish. I
Yeah,
love that. So
that's a
I
very
didn't.
Delphi thing.
Absolutely. And I didn't invent the wheel. I mean, yeah, William Guess's The Tunnel. I mean, my
Yep.
gosh. I mean, that was him trying to finish, I think, an introduction. But so I didn't do this premise thinking, oh, I've done something so original. I'm really trying to make my own thing out of something that's a tradition. It's already happened. A book about trying to write a book, or a book about not being able to write a book. And that's the book.
Yep.
So that was something I knew beforehand would be part of the book. So
Wonderful. Why don't you read a section for us?
okay. So I will read. I've already kind of practiced what I'll do because I'm only doing like 2 events. And then I'm going to Germany for a few months because I'm running from the law. So did I
Yep.
say that out loud? I'm kidding. I'm not running from the law. Um, okay. So I'm going to read just a page or two. This is his first kind of. I did something I've never done before in the book, which is I tell an event, which is his espresso machine exploding, and then I tell it again from kind of a different viewpoint or from a different point in time. So I kind of rehash an event from a different angle. This is the first time this happened. So um, this was the beginning of the end because shortly after the second emergency review, where I was placed on administrative probation, came the espresso incident, that debacle with the espresso machine concealed beneath my desk, which became quite the scandal. The espresso incident, endlessly gossiped about. The espresso incident on the tips of both the students and the faculty's tongues. And walking the halls, I felt the chatter about the espresso incident striking my back like tossed pebbles. It was Philosophy 102, a class overflowing with dullards. And I'd asked one of those dullards to fetch a towel after a malfunction with the espresso machine, since there'd been a rather large release of steam, more or less an explosion, while I'd been cleaning, the Italian espresso machine hidden beneath my desk, a triumph of Italian workmanship. A Nuova Simonelli espresso machine, no less, surreptitiously installed in my class because it was prohibited on campus. And I couldn't bring it home either. I couldn't let my wife see the machine and have her inquire about the cause of that gorgeous contraption, undeniably a work of art, forbidding in its design. Considered a pinnacle in Italian craftsmanship, with its shimmering silver and black exterior, an espresso machine costing more than my own car. And it was a ridiculous expense, a whim which I decided instantly to return as soon as I bought it, until it arrived. And I figured I'd steal a glimpse before sending it back because I'd already gone to the trouble of ordering the Nuova Simonelli and paying for the Nuova Simonelli. So I might as well see this Nuova Simonelli. A small caprice, I reasoned, a meager indulgence for a man whose wife was dying. Yet one look, and I knew I would never return the Nuova Simonelli espresso machine with its gorgeous curves, flat tray, and stunning receptacle, because the Nuova Simonelli was clearly the most beautiful object I'd ever owned. And in order to devote the time necessary to cleaning the Nuova Simonelli, I assigned an in-class essay about sadness and desire, but a pipe burst released a cloud of steam. Thus, I spilled the espresso grounds while leaning my arm against the steam wand, botching the effort and burning my forearm in the process. And I instructed a student to race to the teacher's lounge for a towel, perhaps two, make it three. And the class was disrupted because I not only spilled the espresso grounds, but scalded myself in the process. And motherfucker, I barked in agony. The students, staring in open-eyed alarm, their dull, bovine faces suddenly alert, more cognizant and aware than I'd ever seen, because of the burst of steam and subsequent burn had given them a sudden and unexpected jolt. The water that went through these contraptions was inconceivably hot, something I learned from spending weeks studying the Nuova Simonelli manual that came with the Nuova Simonelli espresso machine. Although it wasn't a manual in the typical sense, nor a booklet or brochure, but a compendium, a goddamn codex, if I'm being honest. The weight and volume testifying to the gravity which these Italians took their coffee-making appliances. And I both resented and respected the manual for its size and encyclopedic diligence, even though calling it a manual was an enormous injustice. For the Nuova Simonelli booklet that came with the espresso machine contained an index and a table of contents and a host of illustrations, all printed on highly expensive photographic-grade paper, glossy no less, weighed close to 5 pounds and included an array of endorsements by coffee experts and celebrities alike. The longest and most verbose by Italian actor Enzo Giordano, who elucidated in great detail his personal experiences with the Nuova Simonelli espresso machines, one of which he'd purchased with his first royalty check from the studio as a professional actor. An older and retired model, no doubt, but it spoke to the loyalty and devotion he had for the brand. And I'll stop there.
I can't laugh because of the surgery, and you're gonna kill me. Like I'm just
Oh, no, please.
the whole time I was reading, I was like, oh, I cannot express emotion. I just need to read.
Yeah,
Like,
I just need a stoic face. Yeah.
that is so fun. It's so funny. One of the authors that come
And
to
that espresso company exists, by the way. That's a
Oh, yeah.
real, yeah, that exists.
that
A lot of the things don't, but that exists.
right.
Yes.
There was a few that I looked up, but all the musicians exist, which I do want to ask you about too. But
Yeah,
like there's a couple times where I was like, wait, is this a real poet that Montaigne knew? And I was like, no, I don't think so. There's someone with that name, but it's like the wrong time period. And there's
right.
like a couple things like that. There I was like, I totally buy this. And then looking down, the Berkshires thing I knew was fake because
Right.
I spent a lot of
Yeah.
time. But
I tweeted about that. I was on Twitter or X for a long time, and I would make these joking references about the Institute.
oh yeah,
Yeah, so it was in like my old Twitter feed when I was on it, and I was already writing the book. I started writing this book a long time ago, not a long time ago, but like 5 years ago, 4 years ago. And so it actually was kind of in a joking way. I'm like, oh, I got a residency at this place that doesn't exist. So
that's so. I probably would have congratulated you without knowing.
I think some people do, yeah. And it's funny because I miss, that's another thing I do in my fiction. I don't mean to kind of digress, but I like that tapestry of the real and the invented. So I don't know, you probably know that piece I did in Lit Hub about the big influence for Reinhardt's Garden, and she
Yep.
doesn't exist.
Yes.
And people, New Directions, Barbara Epler was calling translators in Mexico, and how have I not heard of her?
Yep.
I'm not trying to punk or troll anybody. I'm not trying to, I love being inventive, and I love how the imaginary can kind of mimic the real and blending the two. So when I mix real and fake and people end up looking things up, that isn't to make anyone do work, and it's not meant to be, look how clever I am. It's just something that I love the aesthetics of, that kind of like, I always call it a tapestry.
There's China Mivel. I don't know how to pronounce his name
I
correctly.
don't either. Yeah.
But in one of the issues of the review of contemporary fiction about contemporary British novelists, he does something similar where it references and describes like one real novelist, if I remember right, and then like two that aren't real at all. And
Yeah.
both of them I was like, holy shit, this person's incredible. And I like did the research and went down the rabbit hole. I was like,
Like
no, just
asshole.
keep
Yeah.
referring back to this one article. Like yeah,
Right.
Google hit of one, but good job.
Yeah.
There, you know what with the rhythms reminds me of, and this is maybe this is like a readerly mental trap, is I'm
Sure.
projecting onto this what I've been most reading the most recently, which is a bunch of Stanley Elkin books. Are you familiar with Stanley Elkin at
I
all?
read, I think, a book by him years ago, and I need the right gateway book because I know
Oh,
he's amazing. I know he's very funny. So, he's one
stay
of the writers I admire from afar.
Yeah, stay tuned. One of the forthcoming Mining the Delphi Archive posts is a power ranking of his 11 books.
Nice,
So I'll give you all the insights into where to go. But
beautiful.
he was a writer, passed away some years ago from MS. He and complications thereof. He was a Jewish writer that had a lot of like Catskills humor and that sort of like vaudevillian like and sort of bit
Right.
to it. And I've
Yeah.
been rereading like Dick Gibson show, which is about a radio announcer, like back at the formation of like talk radio essentially, and
Yeah.
he creates like different personas and different characters, and all of it has that same sort of rhythm, that same sort of like da-da, and then
Yes.
it goes and goes and goes. And
Yeah.
reading him is like addictive to me to the point where like if I like the people that I text too much, they'll just be like, you need to stop. Like you need to
Yeah.
like dial it down 20-30% there, buddy. But he
You can
like
text me about this. Yeah.
you get into that flow and it's like
Yeah.
such a good rhythm. And I wonder
Right.
if the question that I was going to ask is like, how much does that rhythm impact? Like you have a plot, you have like a sort of point of view of like you want to express and capture,
Yeah.
but the rhythm seems so like top level for all this. I
Yeah.
wonder how much that plays into your actual line by line writing.
Yeah. No, rhythm plays a huge part, and I always call them digressions. So like normally Bernhard wouldn't have gone off about the coffee manual. He would have
Right.
stayed with the thing in the classroom. And that's a way I think I digress to make it richer and make it funnier. So I think once I have a digression, I just want to kind of keep the voice and the rhythm. And a lot of that is just done obviously through word choice and figuring out the words to repeat and what kind of the stress is on. And I it's weird. It's not something I think of like intellectually. It's more about more intuitive, where I look at the rhythm and I just go, oh, this isn't right. I need to add a sentence or move a sentence and add a beat or whatever. So it's all, of course, dictated by cadence and things, but it isn't as intellectual as kind of intuitive.
Yeah.
But there was a huge digression in the book, which I took out, which was about also in the history, almost like the Montaigne flashbacks, which was a pimp in Budapest. And he
Oh,
had his more expensive prostitutes were in Buda and the cheaper prostitutes were in Pest. So this running joke about, well, he crossed the bridge from Pest to go back to Buda, and it was very funny and I loved it, but it just was too much in the it was too big of a digression. So I kind of removed that. But it going back to your thing, it is all really about if I've got a digression, I know it's going to work like with the manual. I'm like, oh, this is really good. And all of my book selling came in. Like I wouldn't know all these things about quality of paper and glossy and things. And your life experience helps inform how you can add things to make the text richer. And once I knew I had a gateway, oh, this is a funny digression, I think I was able to work on the rhythm. If
yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah,
that
yeah,
makes a lot of
yeah.
sense.
But it's a lot less intellectual and more intuitive.
And there is like this is a little bit off topic, but just a point of point in it. Like there are parts that are very funny and it is very touching. And like the swing you take with talking about the World War II stuff and hunting down the one guy, not to give away too much either,
Sure.
is like really,
Thank you.
powerful and like dark in that sort of like this is like a big, huge net like bad spot, black mark on the 20th century of history. And
Right.
like, it addresses that in a way that like it's not that it comes out of nowhere, but it's surrounded by something that could be seen as a caricature. Like that he
Yeah.
could be pushed to like that limit of being a caricature of something, of like this kind of professor obsessed with stuff and in his head. And then you have in the heart like this really dark story that like
Yeah.
is really important and has like interesting like tangles outwards and like ends up being another one of the parallels that exists in the book, like her paralleled with the dead wife, the way that Marcel's obsession is paralleled with our narrator's obsession. There's like
Right.
just kind of playing off one another. But that's like I mean, it's a bold choice, and I think you did it really well.
Thank you so much. I wanted to make sure what I think even Kleist, when she's telling this story about trying to find this war criminal, this Nazi war criminal in Mexico, I didn't want it to be, and she mentions something out of a bad novel. So if she had found him and faced him and did all that, it'd be all the tropes of a bad novel, of something like, well, okay, it's something that you'd see in a maybe a Netflix series or a movie with a nice bow. And I wanted it to not really have a to have an open end. There's never really closure with things like that. And so yeah, I wanted to go down, and I love Mexico. I love Mexican culture. So really, as a writer, you write what you want to read, and I wanted something in Latin America to be a setting. So I'm like, I'm going to go to Mexico, and I've been to Mexico City several times, not to Cuernavaca. But yeah, so I was hopefully able to mix that with Mexico City, with her having a gallery and just art and World War II, and um, a generation removed from the Holocaust. So I also, last thing I'll say is that I wanted it to be, he is telling you a story that he heard from her mom. So it's almost like two stories removed from the actual events of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Kleist survived. Kleist tells the narrator, and now the narrator is telling the reader. So it's really very much removed.
And
As
Kleist
far
was
as,
creating statues in honor of those events and in honor of the dead people. So
yeah,
there's like that
Polish poets, right,
representational narrative as well of like
right.
I have this. I had to go back through all my crazy text messages to find it, but I sent this the other night as my favorite line from the book. Favorite section of the book is from her point there where it says she says, "Anyway," she said, "I stayed past dusk, certain I would never forgive myself, wanting more than anything to vanish, to disappear forever. But life is relentless. It stops for no one. The trauma, the hardship, they're immaterial. Life continues, with or without you. It doesn't judge you because it doesn't care." Which I thought was really amazing. Also, not the
Thank
sort of
you.
thing you should send to someone at like midnight, but like whatever.
Chad, are you
That's what you
okay?
get. That's what you get by being my friend.
Exactly,
But like
exactly. You
one
know
of the
what you signed up for.
you you probably didn't, but that's okay. You're just
Yeah,
stuck. You
exactly.
can block me.
Exactly.
The
Thank you, Chad.
Emily Dickinson like hints throughout this too are really interesting. You got Bernhard and you got Emily Dickinson.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a wide swath of writers and readers and influences. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love
Sure.
Emily Dickinson. But yeah, I think part of the key is to try and tell these truths, and a lot of them are bitter pills. But with humanity and humor, and kind of almost like you cover a bitter pill with sugar so you can swallow it. And there are these truisms that Kleist says. I use her really. To just rail against I mean, her railing against stupidity. I mean,
That's the
I mentioned
best.
that when we had dinner. Yeah,
I know.
yeah,
We
and
got
that all
screwed
came
out of our
about from
best burgers, but
yes, from a former person that was our president. So that was all, and that's how I got onto stupidity. So
the stupidity thing is great. So,
yeah,
do you want to shift gears a little bit and go back to like the sort of angle of writer, bookseller, publishing house stuff? So, you
yeah,
mentioned early on that being at Brazos helped like introduce you to a wide range of different publishing houses, which is mirrors my experience. Like I worked at Schuler Books and Music in Grand Rapids, and it
yeah,
was there that like we had a very Brazos-like situation. It was like it was a franchise border store before they had borders anywhere else outside of Ann Arbor. So they
yeah,
applied all our inventory, and all we did as booksellers had a different name, different branding, but as booksellers, we would supplement like what they sent us. So they sent the ordering was centralized. We would get a bunch of random books, some of which we did not want, and
yeah,
then everyone was assigned different sections to like beef up and to like find like what's unique from there. I had like business for a long time, so I got way into like dumbass business. I didn't read them, but I knew what would
right,
sell. Um,
yeah,
but we had like the smartest booksellers, and for the fiction section, it was like top of the nation, guaranteed. And that was where I found out about Delkey Archive. I found out
yeah,
about like people like Richard Powers, like things that like back in like the mid 90s,
yeah,
were still like, underground. We didn't have the
absolutely,
same culture that we did now. We went to Book Expo to find out about stuff. There was no
yeah,
internet. Like everything
yeah.
was like totally different.
I
And
loved my borders, yeah, in Florida. They were amazing,
they were
life
amazing. And
life changing.
they had a really good philosophy of like keeping books in stock that even if you sold one copy once a year, the fact that a customer came in looking for that book and found it was more valuable than selling like 50 copies of whatever the newest hot
Yeah,
Colleen Hoover
Da
book is,
Vinci
right?
Code, right,
Yeah, the Vinci
right.
Code. Yeah, right on.
Yeah.
Shots to Dan Brown too.
Ah,
But there was the same thing where we discovered all that, and I wonder like And then just to add to that story a bit, then when I went to work for Delkey and with John, one of his big things was that when we interviewed people for positions, people with bookstore experience were far more valuable and taken much more seriously than anyone else because anyone else might be like a good reader or they might know things, but they probably don't have A, the same work ethic, and
Yeah.
B, just have not had the exposure. Like they don't know, they can't rattle off like 400 books that came out over the past year that they may not have read, but they
Right.
handled. They know the author, they know the publisher, they know what it
Yeah.
looked like, they know what
Yeah.
covers were
They can
attractive.
talk about comps. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We could talk about comps, my favorite thing.
Right. Right. Yeah. But they know that world. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, what was it? So for you, from like first from the perspective of a writer, so you mentioned the finding the presses thing, but how did that impact you at all in terms of like your development as a novelist?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Probably, I mean, the first book, you probably know this, I tell you all that, the first open letter book I read was Sergei Shafek's Darkness. And I mean, that book just still is one of my all-time favorites. But yeah, no, I mean, these smaller presses, I discovered Bologna through the New Directions books. I think I read By Night in Chile before Savage Detectives. And of course 266, etc. on a big press. But no, the smaller presses are a huge influence. I mean, like I said, I mentioned Caesar Ira. A lot of books on Dalkey, William Gass. Um, I'm trying to think all these big influences. New York Review of Books, as far as like I'm a big fan of he was a contemporary with Garcia Marquez.
No, Ribeiro?
Not Rubiero. It'll come to me in 1 second. The Adventures and Misadventures of Mackerel. Alberto Mudis.
Yes.
Yeah, Mudis. So yeah, there's all these. So yeah, the small presses were a huge influence because I mean, I think I'm still developing, but I was definitely really kind of like a sponge and just absorbing things when I was at Brazos. Just it was like I was at a feast and I could just kind of pick up things and read whatever I wanted. And you know, the buyer was really good, so I was finding open letter and just really good stuff. You know.
Yeah, and there is like not to, I mean, it's like sort of a fallacious statement to make, but like there is still some divide between like the corporate publishing world and the small independent press world. Like there's a lot of authors that roll over, obviously, that go from one
Sure.
to the other,
Yeah.
and there's similarities, but there still seems to be like for the most part a sort of like sameness. Like the when I wrote the AI thing the other week, like the heat death of culture aspect to it, where it's like
Right.
you just have like a bunch of like 3.5 books. Nothing's too extreme in any direction. Everyone just sort of swims in that middle. That sort
Right.
of vibe still comes out of the commercial presses, even if they have every once in a while like a crazy like Olga Tokarczuk, which they didn't know
Yeah.
about or discover.
No.
That wasn't
No.
like their thing.
No. Or
It's
Samantha
like someone else.
Schweblin. Whatever.
We were supposed to publish a bunch of her books,
See.
but
Yeah.
it was shut down by someone. But regardless, then the small presses do take all those risks, and it's like
Yeah.
it's something we've talked about from the publishing angle before in terms of like you are a farm team. Like we have to find the real talent. We take big swings. Some of them just don't sell, but
Yeah.
they're like doing things that are outside of because when you do hit, it's that variation, it's that uniqueness that really takes off. So like even
Yeah.
though Lisa Shu would do pen books, Matthias Enard is like a huge one. Speaking of
Yeah.
potential Nobel Prize winners,
Yeah, huge
like
influence on Lesser Ruins. All that
yeah,
writing he did about music, really quick. I justified writing about house and electronic music, going, not everyone cares about this. Most people don't care, but I figure I can write about it passionately because if you love words and language, you don't have to care about dance music. So in Compass, he, of course, I know you published Zone, that was his first book in English, but I think it was. But
was
in Compass, he talks about classical, a lot of stuff I don't care about, but
yep.
the writing is so beautiful. I don't care. So really,
Yeah.
Compass it influenced Lesser Ruins a lot.
Well, I thought, yeah, with the music thing too, I think is really, really interesting because of the way that Marcel does it. Also, for anyone listening out, this will be in the show notes, and for anyone in the class, I put together, Marcel is the son of our narrator. He wants to make a mixtape, and there is a list in the back of his mix tape. So I put it together as a Spotify playlist that I'll link to, so you can
Thank you.
listen to it as you read the book. It's really great. Although I am going back to the
A lot of
Lindstrom
deep
album
house, but yeah.
today, the Lindstrom album today, the with the 28. I haven't listened to that since that came out, but I was
Oh,
like,
it's so good.
ah,
Yeah.
that is such a good. I
And it
forgot
is a
about
little,
that.
it's a little bit cheesy, but in a really cool way. A lot
Yeah,
of the electronic music from like Norway and the Norwegian disco and everything is a little bit kind of cheesy and playful, but that's part of the charm, I think.
I agree. I
Yeah,
agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but I like how he's like his Marcel's thing too is that he's obsessed with this one thing and it's all about mixing. It's all about that. Like you're creating through putting these influences together, putting these
Right.
things next to one another, which is sort of like a weird way to think about book selling. Like you're putting things next to each other and juxtaposing them, and
Yeah.
publishing where we're like, let's sequence things, let's give people this array, let's like put it together as like
Yeah.
and you don't see it from the outside this way, but internally we're always putting together seasons, we're putting together like series, we're putting together strings of things that may not be
Exactly.
consumed in that way, but is intended as a sort of like artistic vision.
Yeah.
If you're like a real publisher, I think like
Yeah,
first,
yeah. Or books that are, they're in conversation.
yeah,
There's a dialogue. They talk to each other. Absolutely. Yeah.
absolutely. So I can see that. So is going back like with John's thing of like, we these booksellers know how to do this. What brought you to Coffee House? How did you end up now switching from like bookselling and
Yeah.
being like one of the premier booksellers in
Right.
the country, beloved by all small presses? Everyone
Thank
wants
you.
more from Mark Haber. Everyone wants their books on display at Brazos because they're going to
Right.
sell 10 times more than they would anywhere else.
Yeah.
Everything. And now you switch.
Yeah.
Now you're on the other side
Yeah.
of the fence, so to speak.
Well, I'll tell you how it came about, but first I will say that yeah, being a bookseller is really an enormous, it's done me, myself, and my wife, who also works at Coffee House, and she worked at Brazos, a huge service as far as it's helped us at Coffee House because bookselling is it's really, really smart. You're reading proofs, maybe, or you're reading translation, but it's also retail. So you're picking up the phone, you're getting yelled at by customers, you're closing, you're cleaning the bathroom. So it's a retail job, and you've got the top of like ideas. You're reading Russian literature, you're reading philosophy, but also you've got someone on the phone that's yelling because they were charged twice, or a kid peed on the toilet seat. It's everything. So you end up having a really good work ethic because it's a job, it's a retail job that also has this glamour if you love books. It's not glamorous to most people, but if you love books, it's really kind of a great position. And you can wax enthusiastic about things you love, which is great, and
Yeah.
introduce people to things you love. So I got into it because around 2022, early 2023, my wife and I had been in Houston for like 11 years, and we were just tired of, I think, living through the pandemic. Everyone kind of wanted to have a new chapter. And she and I both agreed, well, we want to leave Texas. Hurricane season is intense, and as you know, all my family's in Florida right now. It's very scary. And it's a rough way to live every year of going, well, we could get hit. Houston's infamous for really bad infrastructure. Great city, but it floods all the time. It could have a flash flood from just a spring shower. It's really floods badly for an international city. So I started looking out. I mean, I applied to grad schools. I was like anything that would stick. And because I'm a coffee house author, I would get emails from staff or from the publisher saying, well, this is changing. And I kept seeing, I'm leaving coffee house. It was great. And I kept seeing, so I reached out and I said, I've been to Minneapolis. I loved it. Is there a space for maybe marketing publicity? Because that in a way is book selling.
Yeah.
You're putting a face to things you love and bringing it out to the world. It's front facing, public facing. And I interviewed, and it just kind of worked that way. It was really kind of random, and it was not a plan I had. The plan was just to kind of turn the chapter in our lives, move out of Texas, and see what happens. Really, that was it. So it wasn't there was no game plan.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. What's one thing that you've learned that you didn't expect from going over to the publishing side?
Probably being more emphatic about what you and I just said, which is how arbitrary and lucky and timing, how it plays such a big thing. And money. I mean, money, especially for a small price. I know, have gone through this. You'll get a manuscript, you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then you're like, oh, but can we afford it?
Yeah.
They're being shopped around by this publisher and this, and you see things you love get away, and you see things that you don't think are going to be great, even though you love them, maybe succeed. So I'm only starting to learn that publishing is so long. So I've only been at Coffee House a year and a half. So only now, not even now, next year, we'll actually start to see things getting published that were accepted or acquired when I was there. So we're still going through books that are, it's a long runway. So I
Yep.
think just the kind of the arbitrary nature of publishing. It's very, I know people think, well, it's super organized and this things, and I think every publisher works differently, but It's a little chaotic and it's a little bit, yeah, thank you. It's a lot of chaotic. I didn't want to sell it to.
Very ADD friendly
Yeah, it
environment.
really is. Yeah, look at the next shiny thing. Um, and so to be successful on the writer side, it really is just being persistent and unquenchable and just keep trying because it really is hard sometimes to get through the door and it is a game of numbers sometimes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, numbers meaning that an editor, Chad in this case, or Jeremy Davies, our editor, numbers in that you could have a stack of 55 manuscripts and you can only accept three and you only have so much time. So it really becomes a case of, what do we have the time to look at and give the attention it deserves? Because there's so much great stuff out there. And the last thing you want to do is waste an author's time, a poet or a prose writer's time. Knowing that, look, we don't have the time to look at this, or we can't give it justice to what we'd like to do, etc. So it's exciting, it's a little heartbreaking, and yeah.
And
Thank
there's
you.
always like pushing to get attention for stuff. And like,
Oh my gosh, it's exhausting. Yeah, it
I've
is.
and they will never listen to us, so who cares? The Wiley agency constantly is like, "What is your marketing plan for this book?" And I'm like, "Same as every fucking other book. We send it
Yeah,
out to booksellers, we send it to reviewers, we pray
yeah,
for the best, and like we promote it on our website and through our newsletters. Like, I don't know what else you want us to do. Like,
yeah. We can't invent another. Exactly.
there's
Yeah.
not really like we're not gonna like bring Dubravka back from the dead and like
No.
make her tour. Like, what are you asking me this for? Like, what
Right.
kind of like power play are you trying?"
Wiley. Oh my God, you and I could have a separate, yeah. But we live in a very noisy world, and there's so many books coming out. There's so much music, there's so much everything that it's so easy to get lost. It's so easy for the thing that you feel passionate about to almost feel like it's being ignored. And
Yeah.
it's really because there's a plethora of things grabbing our attention. So it's really difficult publicity and marketing to get something that you know is good or that you feel passionate about any attention.
Yeah, yeah,
So, to get
exactly.
reviews, to get, on whatever, some list, all that stuff is really competitive and very hard.
Super, super,
Yeah.
absolutely. So out of any books, you got to name at least one coffee house one, but any books that are forthcoming, what would you recommend?
From Coffee House?
Anywhere, coffee
Oh,
house
anywhere. Oh
or
my
anywhere,
God.
but at least one coffee house book. You gotta
Okay,
gotta
sure.
plug your company.
Okay, let me see. Can you turn the record off? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Always the most impossible question ever.
I know it is because then you've got them in your mind, and suddenly you're asking, like, what?
Yeah.
Um, okay. I will say that just came out yesterday is Rodrigo Fresán's Melvill.
Oh yeah.
If you've not read him, he's just on another level. And I think he was an influence as far as I always think of him as being a very generous writer. He's very
Mhm.
giving. He gives you everything, maybe more than you ask for, but it's worth it. So music and pop culture and philosophy, and he's just. I remember, I think the first time we met, Winter Institute in Asheville, and you said, "Oh, I've got this manuscript that's right. You're gonna love it."
Yes.
And I want to believe that it was probably the invented part, but
It was.
yeah, yeah, he's incredible. So I recommend. I think Melville is probably a really good gateway if you haven't read him.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just fantastic, inventive, fun, and not at the expense of being very literary and very smart. Well translated, Will Vanderheim. I mean, just beautiful, great stuff. Um, so that just came out, and I'm trying to think. Coffee House. Oh wow, we have a book, kind of a debut. He's had a book, I think on a micro press coming out in February called True Failure by Alex Higley. And he's an American writer. It takes place in Chicago, and it's all about kind of the lies that we tell ourselves. And this husband gets fired from his job, doesn't want to tell his wife, and he wants to get on a reality show. And the host of the reality show is also telling a lot of lies. So it's all about these lies we tell people, so it looks like we're successes. And it's really well written and just kind of a really fun, kind of satiric American novel.
Oh, I love it.
True failure.
I think I follow him on
Yeah, he's a really
Instagram.
funny guy. He's a nice guy. I mean, I haven't met him in person, but he's a very nice guy and very kind of just contemporary American fiction. It's very satiric, it's very well written, and it's got a great cover too. It almost looks like the designers that make concert posters. It's got a great kind of, yeah. So
Very cool. Oh, I'm excited to see
yeah,
that. Excited to see that. So
yeah.
we'll wrap up here because I have to say a couple things,
Sure.
skippy things to the class. But
And
hey,
thank you all for listening to me pontificate. Thank you.
thank you for doing this. Thank you for being on here.
My
If
pleasure.
you're
This
listening,
is my
obviously,
launch.
yeah, your launch, big
Yeah.
launch. Well, This will be out. This will be out real fast.
Oh,
I'm gonna
awesome.
put it around today, in fact. But for anyone listening, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts at. Tell your friends. Hell, you can play this for your classroom. Like use these in your classes, man. Do whatever. Tell your parents. Tell your friends. Listen to the podcast. Give us good ratings. Follow us on Twitter at Open Letter Books. I think I'm Chad W. Post everywhere. I can never. I can never nail these endings. I'll never land this ship, and that is okay.
Yes.
That is a sort of repetitive and obsessive nature
You
of
not making the landing is its own beautiful kind of landing, though. So, yeah.
just always flubbing and keep grinding.